I'm going to be talking about the QIAGEN biomedical ontology. Thanks for that introduction. So we've had an introduction already to ontologies in general. I'll probably be repeating some of that, but our ontology is organized a little bit differently. So this will be an interesting contrast, I think. So QIAGEN is a life sciences company. They're involved in a lot of different things. They actually acquired the company that I have been a part of for some time, which is called Ingenuity Systems. And Ingenuity was, and the same sort of, a lot of the same people and the same location and all that are still developing bioinformatics software. A handful of different software applications. I'll talk a bit more about them specifically, but what they have in common is the idea of trying to take customer data and allow I should say enable customers to gain insight from their data. And Ingenuity was born at a time when genomics data and molecular biology data was becoming more and more high volume. Experimental techniques were just beginning to be developed where people were able to get tens of thousands of data points at a time. You could do surveys of which genes were expressed in tissue, and there might be 17 or 18,000 genes, and you'd have the answer all at once. And there was an analysis bottleneck for the data. And so there's a question of how do we show people the patterns within their data. And the QIAGEN, what is now the QIAGEN biomedical ontology, powers the software that allows us to answer some of those questions. So, and I've been, my formal title is Ontology Engineer. I've been doing this now at Ingenuity and now QIAGEN for almost 7 years. So and we have a group of, at any given time, like 7 to 10 people working on the ontology, per se. So I'm going to talk about, this is brief outline, I'm going to talk about what the ontology can do, give a couple of examples. Where is it used in practice? Some of the requirements that we have to impose on the ontology for it to be useful to us. What it looks like, how we build it and maintain it, and how we maintain as part of that or as a follow-on to that, how we what we do for quality control. So all of these things are critical for us. So a couple of examples of what it can do. This is a simple example. So I want to know about all the lung diseases that aren't cancers. So that's a query that I can pose to the ontology or against the ontology. We get a little over 200 results, and they range from things that you might have thought of naturally to things that might not have been quite so easy to come up with, depending on your level of expertise. So we can start with like bronchitis, right? So, and we have a definition for each thing that's free text and internal, but I'm showing snippets of those for convenience. So bronchitis would be one. Infectious lung disease is at a different level of specificity, but another concept that we would cover. Somewhere under that, we'd have fungal pneumonia. You might have an example of a kind of poisoning that affects the lungs, so berylliosis, and a bunch of other examples here, just to give you an idea of the sort of the spectrum. So we say lung diseases that aren't cancers. It suggests that already we can categorize things in more than one way and do some sort of basic manipulation of those categories. Here's a more complicated example. I want to know about all the active clinical trials for drugs that treat cancer in patients that have mutations in a particular gene. So, okay, I get 175 results from that query, and here's a few examples with the drugs that go with them. They're across just 5 different drugs. So what kind of stuff has to go into this? There's a lot of knowledge that has to be brought together, unified, and in order for us to synthesize this answer. So we need to know about what things are considered to be drugs. We need to know which ones are considered to treat cancer. So we need to know about drug approvals, which is, and specifically for drug approvals, what the indications are for the approved drug. It's always part of an approval. We need to know about drug indications in some more detail, because we need to know drugs that are indicated for people with mutations in a particular gene. So we need specific indications, and we also need a way of framing those indications in a way that separates the genes so it's queryable for us. And then finally, we need to know which trials are out there and which ones are active. And these data come from disparate sources. So those are some examples of what we can do, and I'll try and get into what we bring together in order to make that possible and how we do that. So Ingenuity, or I'll say Ingenuity more often than I probably should, but really we're now QIAGEN. So QIAGEN makes software to contextualize molecular biology and genomics data sets. So there's different kinds of contextualization. One of the things that we do and that we've done for the longest time is to make software to align customer data to the world of relevant biological knowledge. So you tell me there's 100 genes that I know are involved somehow in this phenomenon that I'm studying. That's what my data tell me. I don't know what those genes have in common. I don't know which ones might be the drivers for the process. But if I layer that list onto a knowledge base where I know about a lot of pre-existing, or where I can bring in pre-existing knowledge about different relationships that those genes have to each other, I can draw those genes on a canvas. And I can start to see, here's a system that might be starting to reveal itself to me, and that might help design follow-on experiments. So we also facilitate insight into existing biomedical knowledge without even having to add in specific questions about my own data or a customer's data. We can, through the ontology power, inference across multiple individual facts that may come, or we say findings, since we're skeptical about what's a fact. But we can power inference, of course, across multiple assertions from disparate sources or from the same source. And so I'm showing here the two software products that are sort of most prominent in our portfolio. There's Ingenuity Pathway Analysis, which is does pathway and network analysis, and that's been around for over 10 years now. And variant analysis is a little bit newer, and the idea there is to be able to come in with clinical data sets that are from particular patients with particular issues. We might come in with and basically analyze sequence data, analyze their genomic data to try and understand what the most likely suspect mutations are that might be causing their problem or might be closely related to their problem. So, and that sort of thing turns out to be really challenging, because you take a genome, any random genome, and compare it to sort of the so-called canonical genome, and there's on the order of 1 million variations, right? So which one should I be focusing on, right? So by taking a lot of pre-existing knowledge and a certain amount of insight and overlaying that, we can quickly filter out the things that are likely inconsequential or irrelevant, and find that we're able to arrive at a much shorter list of likely suspect variations. So, all right. So we need biological knowledge to be organized in a way that's accurate, and we need to be able to, by the way, to test that accuracy. It needs to be normalized in at least a couple of different ways. One is we want to be able to think of concepts, not terms. And so we want to be able to map synonyms to a concept. Meningitis has these couple of individual synonyms, and that's one kind of normalization. And we also want to be able to map different syntactic structures to the same meaning. So meningitis is a single term, but it can be defined in terms of other concepts. It really means inflammation of meninges, which some other author might refer to as the meninx, although hopefully not. So this idea of having different ways of saying the same thing, not just using different terminology, but actually with different structures, is something that we have to be able to get past. It has to be sophisticated enough to be useful. So we have to be able to capture, when we're capturing assertions from the world, we need to be able to capture different kinds of assertions, and we need to be able to link them together so that we can really get the inference power that we need. So here's I have a very simple and mathematical looking example. We might have one finding that tells us that some protein, say, causes some other pair of proteins to bind each other, B and C. And we have another statement that says B, C binding increases process D. Well, we want to be able to infer what in this case might seem obvious, that should tell us that assuming that the conditions are met for both of those statements at the same time, that A should be increasing process D, right? But those two component statements are of different forms. And so we need to be able to have a unified system that allows us to infer across them. Finally, we want a system that is efficiently extensible, right? So, and this gets us a little bit away from a relational database approach, where adding new kinds of relationship types can be a real challenge. We want to be able to do that quickly and easily and manipulate those sorts of things. So I have a short list of some relationship types that we might want and have. So physical part of something is physically a part of something else. Implicit location is something that we use, and we'll see again to talk about the location that a process might have. That as a reader or as a domain expert, you would say, oh, of course. But the ontology has to have that modeled in so that we know that a particular location is implied by a particular process that's happening. Another example has mutations. So some gene might be asserted to have a particular variation or mutation. So, yeah?
Do you manually determine the extended relationships?
Do we manually determine?
Yeah, those extended relationship types, like is mutational. Do you manually determine them? Can you automatically determine them?
So we want examples of the relationships, or
when you want to figure out what extensions you need to make, can you automatically discover them, or you have to sit down and manually?
So far, that's a manual process. So right. So the question was, can we automatically determine? We have some way of automatically calculating when a new relationship type is needed, and the answer is no. We might be able to come up with such a thing, but we don't have anything in place to do that now. So
there's no sort of meta process in ontologies for determining that. Is it always ad hoc?
You speaking in general that there's? So yeah, I mean, I can't speak in general to whether anyone has come up with such a thing, but I mean, I can say at least for this space that yeah, we still have to do that manually. Now we can infer the need for an individual assertion on an existing relationship type, and we can sometimes infer, but still manually, the idea that a new relationship type is needed, for example, when we start to see violations of some rules that we can't resolve by sort of using our existing relationship types. We realize, oh, actually we have some, for example, we might have some relationship type that really is encompassing multiple relationship types and ought to be split. So we encounter that sort of situation. That's maybe as close as I can think of that we come to an automatic process for deciding when a new type is needed. So we use a frame-based ontology, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means. So first of all, we have concepts, that is to say, kinds of things, and the kinds of things can be any kinds of things. Now, we model the things, the concepts of the things directly. So we are not really at a remove where we're talking. So Jay was talking about topics. We talk about the things themselves. So we would have a concept for organism. A subclass of that or a subtype of that would be mouse or E. coli. There's other physical things like cells, but then there's other things as well. And we'll distinguish those things, and I'll show more of that in a moment. But so diseases are obviously not physical things. Cancer is a kind of disease. And then in addition to processes and physical stuff, we also have concepts for properties, and we distinguish that as well. So advanced, benign, narrow, motile, those are all adjectives, basically. Yeah?
I mean, I don't see actually much difference between organism and a topic, because a mouse is something you can see, an organism is something you cannot see. It's a convention. We say that all these things are organisms.
Right.
In the same way, we can say all the Chinese restaurants are restaurants. Right? So in a way, your organism is a topic, and your disease is a topic.
Well, sure. You can think of it that way. We would prefer to think of it as more general concepts. And instead of talking about Chinese restaurants, we would talk about the concept Chinese restaurant. There could be, and then there could be more specific, a more specific concept to cover Szechuan Chinese restaurant. And you might even have, and on. So we don't have a bright distinction between very broad topics and very and much more narrow topics or concepts. But we find that it solves a lot of problems if we consider the concepts or the classes to be representing the things themselves. And that might become more clear later on, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that as well. So physical things, temporal things or processes, properties, and properties, of course, can be subclassified in their own ways as to what they are applicable to, as well as sort of assertions themselves. And kinds of assertions also have a place in the ontology. So in addition to concepts, we have relationship types, as noted. So is the most prominent kind of relationship type. But then we have many others. I was looking earlier, and we have about 1,000 different relationship types in use in the ontology right now. So physical part of is one example of. So I guess I think from a topic point of view, for example, Illinois might be a subtopic, or sorry, Chicago might be a subtopic of Illinois. From our perspective, Chicago has a particular kind of relationship to Illinois, which is physical part of, and is obviously distinct from an ISA relationship. So physical part of, and then this is a more recent one, definitional agents. So bacteria are the implicit agent or definitional agent for bacterial infection. Right? So we would consider we might think of bacterial infection as being a kind of a compound concept, and it can be defined in terms of its parts. Right? So bacterial infection is infection by bacteria. It's a kind of infection, but it's not a kind of bacteria. Right? There's a different relationship there. So concepts are encoded in classes, what we call classes, and Relationship types are encoded in slots, which is and both of these are terms from sort of the standard way of thinking of frame-based ontologies. In addition to those two kinds of things, we have instances, and I should talk about that now. So instances for us are not related to how specific something is, but rather a particular reference to a thing gets its own instance, right? So a statement about mouse that we encode would not refer to the class mouse. It would refer to an instance of mouse, right? And that allows us to assert all kinds of details that we obviously are not appropriate for the class itself. So we have classes, slots, we have instances, and then we can also encode scalars, so strings, numbers, booleans. There's a few other kinds that I won't talk about here. And the first three things are what we would call frames. Those are frames in the ontology. And scalars are not. So a frame here is, this is not a use of the term that I think we're used to hearing. It doesn't mean like a box around something, but it's rather, think of it as a superclass, if you will, for the idea of classes and instances and slots. Anything that's a frame can have we can say things about a frame, and we can assert relationships among frames. So we can assert relationships between instances, between classes, or even we can have relationships from one slot to another, right? We can talk about the relationship between two kinds of relationships. So that's the very sort of fundamental structure that we work within for frame-based ontology and for our ontology. So here's a little bit about what this looks like. We'll start with two concepts, an anatomical part and physical thing. So anatomical part has an is-a relationship to physical thing. Any anatomical part is a physical thing. Below that, we might have the brain. We might also have the hippocampus. Now, you might notice that there's probably a relationship between those two, but it's not an is-a relationship, right? They're both anatomical parts. We need a new kind of relationship to indicate that something is a physical part of another. So representing that in what actually does look like blue, good. So that's all. So physical things are under one. We are under one sort of tree in the ontology. And I should say now, because I don't think I'm going to say it otherwise, that we cheat a little bit. So for us, superclasses, or the superclass relationship, is synonymous with is-a. And so basically, we get one slot type for free, or one relationship type for free. And so we assert superclassing when we mean to say something is a something else. All the other slots have specific names and are specifically asserted as in a slightly different syntax. So at the top of the resulting tree, we have a very small number of roots. We have physical thing, we have temporal thing, and we have a few other things that I'll talk about. So temporal thing, something that occurs in time, we include under that, among other things, diseases. We consider diseases to be processes. This disease is sort of a made-up concept to begin with, so this doesn't always work as well as you might like, but it's the best that we've been able to do, and it works most of the time. And then you have more specific cancer, brain cancer. So brain cancer can have this implicit location brain. So this is the same thing as similar to what I was talking about earlier, talking about defining compound concepts in terms of their component parts, right? So, and we find this to be very useful in terms of maintaining quality of the disease branch and of the temporal branch in general, is keeping track of which things are implicitly in a particular location. That's one of the pieces to our puzzle. We support multiple inheritance. So brain cancer, in addition to being a cancer, is also a brain disorder. Both of those things are diseases. We prohibit, the only thing we prohibit in terms of superclass relationships or ISA relationships are cycles. We don't have any circular relationships on ISA slots, although we don't formally prohibit it on other slots. So it's sometimes we need. In a few cases, we might have rules like that, but the Ontology Engine itself doesn't prohibit it except for ISA slots. Other than that, anything goes in terms of ISA, unless we define a rule to indicate that we don't want to see certain kinds of things. So, for example, we probably don't want it. We definitely don't want to see any properties that are also considered processes or any physical things that are considered temporal things. Those are mutually exclusive, and we have ways of enforcing that. So I mentioned that assertions themselves get classes in the ontology. So we have something called information-based thing. Findings go under those, and then we have different kinds of statements that we can make, and each kind of statement gets a class. So one of those classes is a disease association finding. It's already fairly specific. An example might be a particular disease being associated with a particular mutation. So we see here a particular mutant gene, and this cryptic thing here is the description for a particular mutation. Has been observed with brain cancer in human. So to make this statement, and I'm not going to break it all out here, but a statement like this would be modeled in terms of instances of each of the component parts. So for example, there would be an instance of brain cancer here. There would be probably one instance of human for the location. There would be an instance of the MSH2 gene. There would be an instance of mutation with some details, including this description, etc. And all of that will be hanging off of sort of a backbone that was an instance of disease association finding. So, and all of that lives in the ontology.
Just curious, is this the extent of knowledge about cancer we know? The occurrence of a gene with a specific cancer?
The short answer is no.
I mean, is it like good kind of decent amount of information? Do we have much more information?
We have a lot more information. So, I mean, there's different kinds of information that we have about diseases. One kind of information that people are very interested in is what mutations will make me sick, and what mutations correlate with treatment by a particular drug, a successful treatment, I should say, with a particular drug or class of drugs. So there's a lot of interest in observations that show some co-occurrence. Correlation is a stronger term, and causation is a stronger term yet. But we start with co-occurrence in individual cases, and then we can build up to correlation. And maybe we can infer causation if we know enough about the mechanism, or we can learn about the mechanism. But there is a lot of interest in these particular kinds of observations. Yeah, go ahead.
So how does that kind of data come into your ontology building system?
How do we get it?
Yeah, I mean, what does the data look like?
Right. So the data come from several sources, and I'll talk about that in a few slides. So let's sort of put that off momentarily. But yeah. You're totally right. I put that there just for no, that's correct. So type of really should point to the thing that it's a type of. You're talking about this arrow here. So the question was, why is this arrow pointing the wrong way? And the answer is because I made a mistake. This one is pointing the correct way, right? So type of means an instant is a relationship that is reserved for relating instances to classes, and it indicates what it basically is the primary thing, I should say, that defines what an instance is, right? anonymous instances can live on the ontology, but we don't like to see them. And they're usually mistakes. So yeah. Okay, so I think I've said this, but so statements themselves are objects in the ontology, both kinds of statements and the individual statements. So data sources. There's a wide variety of data sources that we use, and I'm definitely not going to talk about all of them, but we have a variety of them, and we need to keep up to date with them for them to be useful to us. And we have a variety of techniques to get data from them into the ontology. So, and I've sort of divided them here into their own little ontology. So we have structured sources that we trust pretty well. And for those sources, we can write scripted imports. And so one of the things that we do is maintain scripts or relatively small programs that parse these different sources. So like EntreGene is the name for the National Library of Medicine, the NIH's database for genes. OMIM is the Online Mendelian Inheritance in Man database. This is hosted now at Johns Hopkins University, and it's a database that is now online, but goes back to the 60s and is basically descriptions of relationships between genes and diseases, and particular variants and diseases. This first one is very highly structured. OMIM is a little bit less structured, but still has the parts of it that are useful to us are the structured parts. And in both cases, we write scripts that go through all the steps of parsing. First of all, we have to decide what kinds of statements we want to bring in from these sources, and then we have to map each of their terms to concepts in our ontology. So in that sense, we're using the ontology or the parts of the ontology as a dictionary, right? And so anyway, we have scripted imports. We run these periodically. We make them incremental so that for efficiency, we're only updating the parts that have changed. We keep track of where data came from, when we got it, what date was asserted on it in the original source, if they gave us a version or a date, etc. On the other end of the spectrum, and there is a spectrum, is the literature. So we also curate a lot of stuff from the literature. And of course, the literature, by its current nature, is pretty unstructured. Right? We're basically dealing with prose interspersed with figures and tables. And for that, we need a manual process. And so we have a whole process to train people to go through articles and extract the statements that are relevant to our needs. Yep. So we don't use the tagging tools from NLM, but we do. We prioritize the articles that we want to go after, partially on the basis of the tags that are applied by NLM. So articles, for practical purposes, any article that we curate has to come from, has to have an entry in PubMed, the public repository of biomedical literature. That's hosted by the National Library of Medicine. Medline is sort of a refined version of PubMed, but we don't wait around for records to graduate to Medline. We're in a hurry. So sometimes we're lucky enough to have the more tagging that's been associated. Sometimes we don't. So we want to reduce our dependencies on sort of outside sources, especially when it comes to the literature, so that we can curate something with as few bottlenecks as possible. But we do utilize it when it's there to help us along.
Okay, I was going to say, instead of waiting for Medline, can you use the NLM tools to try to do your first pass at tagging yourself?
Right. So tagging, we find tagging is useful to us for two reasons. One, we want to identify articles of interest in the first place that we might ever want to get. And two, we want to identify the priority of an article, which ones do we want to get first.
For the manual curation, could you use some of the NLM just to assist with a first pass, and so the people doing it would have guesses and some of the text.
So I can't get too deeply into some of this, but I will say, right, I mean, it depends. We have a couple of different processes depending on, we have several workflows actually for manual curation. One, some tools, but not necessarily those tools. We do want to help the curators as much as we can, but at the end of the day, they have to be expert enough to make the right calls in terms of the individual findings that they're extracting in the model that they're using. Yeah, I guess that's why I'm framing the sort of the tagging question as I am. We wouldn't use tagging in place of curation, right? Right. Yeah, to save people time and to help them understand. It's like, oh, we're giving this paper to you. We want you to curate out all of the relationships between mutations and diseases. Maybe you'd like to know which diseases we think are in this paper and which genes, right? So we'll take a good stab at that. And, yeah. I'm sorry? Right. I mean, parts of the paper gets a little interesting.
At least the different tagged parts. You tag a phrase as a concept and the other one, and then you have other tools that show some sort of relationship that have the data.
Right. Right. I mean, I think the closest we come to doing that sort of thing is to help us understand more specific topics, right? So if we've identified say a certain combination of topics that are probably discussed in a paper, that can help us understand that it's in some more specific topic that represents that synthesis. But in terms of that's probably as far as we currently go. So there is this manual. There are, like I said, several manual curation workflows. These are tool assisted, and the tools are informed by the ontology. So in addition to sort of whatever pre-tagging we're doing for literature articles, when an article is actually in the process of curation, the curators are using tools that already know about all of the concepts modeled in the ontology. So if they enter a term that they see in the paper, we can tell them, oh yes, we know about that term, that's a valid term. At the same time, they have the opportunity to make a term request. So if they're not convinced that the concept that they, or the term that they need in order to capture that finding is available in the ontology, there's a built-in workflow for them to make that request, and that goes to another team, and that some other team does the modeling and the addition into the ontology. All right, so somewhere in the middle here we have what I'm calling semi-structured sources. So that's things like, as it turns out, the clinical trials database. So the clinical trials database is a structured source. It's available, the records are available as XML documents, and they're pretty nicely structured. But we find that, first of all, they don't go to the level of detail that we always need. And second of all, sometimes they're a little bit cavalier about how things are not structured, I guess, but what terms are used within the structured data. There are particular sort of systemic reasons why that's the case for that database. They're not that important. The point is that we can pull data out, we can import data into our ontology from clinical trials with an automated process, but it needs a little bit of an assist. And so we have that model as well, where we have people doing a certain amount of prefixing. We might maintain a list of fixes that we want to persist into that data source. We found an error, we want to fix it, but next time we do the import, we don't want that error to come back, so we maintain like a patch list, essentially. Now is probably a good time to mention that in our process, when we're doing these imports from structured databases, it's not unusual for us to find problems. And because we're synthesizing data from so many different sources, and because we have such a strong need for quality, we find that we're very well positioned when we're running our tests to find issues that the authors didn't know about. And so we actually develop relationships with the owners of these data sources, and basically they fall into one of two categories: people who are interested in the feedback and very happy to have it and fix things right away, and people who are, not disinterested but less responsive. And so, we adjust our behavior accordingly. It's easiest for us if someone can just fix the stuff and then we'll pick it up next time. But we also maintain workflows that allow us to keep track of the changes that we would need to apply if we don't expect them to be committed by the owners. So,
question: do you have anything? Can you like this ranking of data sources?
Yeah.
Is it something public? Can you like give the 5 stars to the data house?
That's so tempting, but no, we really can't do that. I'm sorry? What sort of errors do we find? Sure. So one that I can talk about because they're very responsive is ClinVar. So it's not mentioned on this slide, but ClinVar is a fairly new database being developed by NLM and maintained by the folks over there. And it stands for something like clinical variations. And so it's basically they're capturing records of these observations similar to what I've talked about a couple of times of genetic variations and their correlation or their co-occurrence with disease, particular diseases. Sort of both. So basically it's individual cases. But they are sort of a secondary source, and they themselves import data from other sources, including a lot of clinical labs, but also including some other databases. So they themselves are consolidators, and we in turn import data from them. But we find, for example, that so the description that I showed earlier for a mutation. This is in a particular language. There's a syntax here, and there are syntax rules that you can apply. And writing those rules in a way that you can run them automatically can be a little tricky, but we've gone ahead and done that because it's so important to us. And so we can, at a glance, say to the ClinVar folks, hey, we just imported 200,000 of your records, and these 3 have invalid syntax. Could you have a look? And they're like, great, thanks for letting us know. And so that's one kind of example. But then we'll also have more difficult cases, like in clinical trial records. There's a place for the condition, and that can mean the disease that's being treated or that they're testing the drug against. Right. So clinical trials are basically about treatments and diseases for the most part, not all of them. So the condition might mean, oh, this is the thing, this is the disease that the drug ostensibly treats, and that's the hypothesis that we're testing. Or it might refer to one of the entry criteria for the trial, right? Pregnancy, smoking, right? So we're not trying to cure pregnancy, right? But that's an example of maybe sort of a database issue where most of the time it really does mean the indication for the drug, but not always. And so we have to deal with that. There are a number of other examples. Is that?
Yes, so it's mainly data conveying rather than experimental errors that you're.
Right. Although we see some of the latter. We don't see. I don't know if we see experimental errors. One of the things that we find in the literature, though, is so. For example, we might have an author describing a DNA change and the corresponding protein change. We'll capture that as as part of a single finding, and we have all kinds of tests that we run against our data, including, can that protein change come about from that DNA change? Sometimes the answer is no. And so in a case like that, we have to go back and figure out what the source of the error is. Sometimes it's the curator, right? Our reader typed something wrong. Sometimes it's the author of the paper. Nobody ran their paper through an analysis engine, right? There was peer reviewed. It was reviewed by other human beings. So these kinds of errors do slip through. We're all humans. And so we do find mistakes like that that are conceivably more insidious.
The scientist to do your data entry to get the results back.
I'm sorry?
Seems like you could convince the scientists or to have somebody do the data entry for you so that they could check it.
Things like that would be really cool. We're not there yet, and it wouldn't be us. But the idea of having like a public repository where certain kinds of findings in published literature were recorded, and that repository could be responsible for doing those kinds of tests would be great. The one example the example that I'm most familiar with in the biological sciences that does do something like that is the protein data bank. So if you if you're a structural biologist and you solve the structure of a protein, especially by crystallography, you end up with data files in one of a variety of formats. And one of the sort of basic requirements of the field is that if you're going to publish that structure, you have to deposit the data in this repository. Now, when you deposit the data, there's a series of tests that are run against the data to ensure that it makes sense. There's basically data integrity. And if it fails those tests, you can't deposit. And so if there were something like that in the area of genomics, it would be great. But it wouldn't solve the problem that there are decades of literature out there that people are still interested in that existed before, even if that repository were created tonight. Like, right? We still have to be able to capture data from the past. So we don't. It would help us going forward, and it would help a lot of people going forward. But we still have to have a process like this. All right. Okay. So finally, something I haven't mentioned, or what I might call sophisticated but unreliable sources. So like diseases are a particularly difficult problem to solve because they're kind of synthetic concepts. So or made up maybe is fair. How you classify diseases and what disease is another broader kind of disease is a matter of some debate and fluidity. Right? Opinions change as our understandings of disease mechanisms change. So there are different databases out there. Some of them are ontologies that attempt to classify diseases, but we use them as guides, and they're very helpful, but we don't find them sufficiently good to be able to import them in any kind of automatic way. And so things like the disease branch of our ontology are basically entirely manually curated. So that's a thing. Right, so like I said, these are still useful as guides. To locate and correct the errors, we have resident experts, we might say domain experts, and we have a variety of internal consistency tests, which I keep talking about. So within the ontology, in addition to the physical things and the temporal things and the information-based things, the findings, we also have a branch of the ontology just for tests, which also exists as assertions inside the ontology, or objects even inside the ontology. So, and we have a variety of types of tests, so constraint types, and we have the ability to make more on the fly. So, and some of them are built in, and some of them are what we call roll your own. So for some of the simple kinds of tests, regardless of where they came from, we can restrict slot values to be of a particular type. So values of this relationship or the destination for this relationship might need to be a string or a class or an instance of some particular class. We can do the same thing, by the way, for what we call the slot domain, where a slot can be attached, where it can come from. We can restrict the cardinality of slot values, so the number of values that a given slot can have when it's attached to a given frame. And we can restrict its exact number, or its maximum, or its minimum. We look at that. So for example, every class has to have exactly one, maybe it's easier to say title. So that doesn't mean it can have only one term that maps to it, but there's one term that's the name. And everything else we call synonyms, or some other kind of term. What else? We can restrict multiple inheritance. So remember I said properties and processes, or properties and physical things are mutually exclusive. We need to be, if that's going to be true, we need to enforce it with a constraint. So these are all tests that have to be written into the ontology. There's a regex engine, so we can control string values with regex matching, either positive or negative tests. And then there's some more complex kinds of tests. We can prohibit duplicate findings, but that involves digging into the structure of each finding and looking for ones that have the same structure. Maybe not the same exact assertions, but the same structure. So what else? We can test the consistency of class modeling. So this becomes very powerful for us, and this is one of the ways that we maintain the integrity of the class structure. So for example, brain cancer, which is defined as cancer of brain, that is to say in terms of cancer in brain, should have a number of characteristics. We know that it should be a subclass of cancer because it's cancer of something. And we know that it should be a subclass of brain disease because, oh, by the way, we have the definition for brain disease, that it is disease of brain, right? So, and we also know that this is cancer of brain, cancer is a disease. So we can infer across the ontology to look for hints, basically, that we're missing a relationship, or sometimes that a relationship is incorrect. So we have over 9,000 individual constraints in the ontology. We run them every night, and we deal with the violations. We classify them in terms of how critical they are. We don't treat all of them as priority 1, but that gives us the ability to know where we stand. And in addition to that, we have a system set up such that any change made to the ontology triggers running of any constraints that are likely to be relevant to that change. And whomever committed that change, if their change seems to have caused a violation, gets an email. And so that happens within the hour. So, and that sort of quick feedback process allows us to reduce the error rate overall. We're not in a position where we can instantaneously run tests at the time of assertion, but we're getting closer. All right, so with that, I'll finish up. The ontology, so I haven't talked at all about the engine that drives the ontology, but the ontology is run, or it lives inside a thing that's called the Ingenuity Knowledge Representation System. It's our own internal software, and that software has been around now for really as long as Ingenuity's been around. It's developed and maintained currently by Corey Cook. I'll mention a couple other names. Sarah Tannenbaum is our director of content, and for a long time managed the ontology group, and Kaushal Parekh is our current manager coordinating the group. And I can be reached here, and I'll take any last questions.
One thing I was curious about that you touched on but didn't really go into much detail on is taking different ways of saying the same thing. And so my question is, what process do you have for, is that manually curated to say, meningitis and meninx are the same thing?
So I would say it's the common, we automate it as much as we can. And then the rest is manual. So, and there's different layers to that. We have different mechanisms for asserting those definitions on compound classes. And then those definitions in turn are used to unify the meanings at another layer, and that layer is pretty much fully automated. So we have what we call the root ontology, which is where we store all the meanings of stuff. The findings live in another part of the ontology, but then somewhere in between there, there's another layer where we store all of these we call functional annotations. So the meanings that we might have, and if a meaning can be asserted in more than one way, and we learn that from a definition or something like it, they get joined in that layer. So is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So we don't really know the medical things at all, so I'm kind of in the dark as to what's in these papers and what are they like. I'm sort of assuming they would be statistical, reporting on statistical correlations and things like that. So do you have any statistical method or representation mechanism?
Well, that sort of content certainly is out there. And I would say that, I guess I should make the point that we focus on what I would call qualitative rather than quantitative data that we're capturing. We're capturing relationships, and sometimes there's a need to capture quantitative measurements, but it's surprisingly infrequent.
Chain of, you would find links. You basically take in these links in a chain, and then you assemble chains on request.
Yeah, for some value of request. That's right. Now, I mean, that's not to say that we don't capture quantitative information at all. For example, someone's doing a population study, and they find that, of the 100 people they looked at with this disease, 70 had this mutation, and the other ones did not. We want to know those numbers. So we'll capture that kind of thing as well. But the statistics are, I would say, there's more statistics happening after the ontology than sort of encoded in it, right? So we might do statistics on the population of findings and learn something that way. But it's usually too much detail, and it sort of gets it to a level where it's harder to do useful inference if we're capturing the precise statistical measurements from each assertion in each paper. So we generally don't do that. All right.